History books tell us about kings, revolutionaries, and scientific geniuses. But what about the LGBTQ plus figures who shaped the world? Their stories were erased, rewritten, or ignored, but not anymore. From the man who broke Nazi codes to the politician who fought for LGBTQ plus rights, these trailblazers left a lasting impact on history. Yet most schools never mention their names. Why? Because their identities challenge the norms of their time. Today, Rainbow Spotlight uncovers 10 LGBTQ plus icons who changed the world, but never got the recognition they deserved. Their stories will shock you, inspire you, and make you question everything you thought you knew about history. It's time to set the record straight. Well, maybe not straight. Let's begin. Number 1. Oscar Wilde, the literary genius who paid the price for love. Oscar Wilde wasn't just a writer, he was a sensation. Witty, flamboyant, and dangerously intelligent, he dominated the literary world of the late 19th century. His plays, like The Importance of Being Earnest, were bold, satirical, and unapologetically sharp, making him one of the most celebrated playwrights of his time. But Wilde's brilliance couldn't protect him from the harsh realities of being a gay man in Victorian England. In 1895, at the height of his fame, he was arrested for gross indecency, a charge that essentially criminalized his love for men. His downfall came after a bitter feud with the father of his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, who publicly exposed Wilde's homosexuality. What followed was one of the most infamous trials in British history. Wilde, refusing to deny who he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The punishment broke him, physically, emotionally, and socially. Once the toast of London's elite, he died penniless and in exile. Yet today, Wilde is remembered not as a criminal, but as a literary icon, an LGBTQ plus martyr. His words, his wit, and his defiance live on. Drop a 1 if Oscar Wilde's legacy still inspires you. Number 2. Magnus Hirschfeld, the scientist who fought for LGBTQ plus rights before it was safe. Decades before the modern LGBTQ plus rights movement, Magnus Hirschfeld was already fighting for equality. A German physician and sexologist, he dedicated his life to proving that being queer wasn't a crime, a sin, or a sickness. It was simply human. In 1919, Hirschfeld founded the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, the first of its kind in the world. It was a groundbreaking center for LGBTQ plus research, offering medical care to trans individuals and advocating for the decriminalization of homosexuality. At a time when queer identities were taboo, Hirschfeld boldly argued that love and gender existed on a spectrum. But his work made him enemies. In 1933, when the Nazis rose to power, they saw his institute as a threat. They raided the building, burned his research, and destroyed decades of progress. Hirschfeld, forced into exile, watched as the world regressed into fear and intolerance. Though he died before seeing LGBT plus rights recognized, his impact remains undeniable. His early work laid the foundation for modern queer activism, proving that science and advocacy can change the world, even when the world refuses to listen. Drop a 2 if Magnus Hirschfeld's bravery inspires you. Number 3. Alan Turing, the war hero the world betrayed. Imagine saving millions of lives, only to be punished for who you love. That's the tragic story of Alan Turing, the mathematical genius who broke the Nazi Enigma code during World War II. His work at Bletchley Park helped the Allies defeat Hitler, shortening the war and saving countless lives. Some say he's the reason we don't speak German today. But instead of being hailed as a hero, Turing was treated as a criminal. In 1952, he was arrested for gross indecency after being exposed as a gay man. Given the choice between prison or chemical castration, he chose the latter, a forced medical procedure that wrecked his body and mind. Just 2 years later, he was found dead from cyanide poisoning. Officially ruled a suicide, but to this day, some question what really happened. It took over 50 years for Britain to acknowledge its crime. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a royal pardon, but the damage was already done. A man who should have been celebrated was erased. Now Turing is remembered as more than a war hero. He's a symbol of how society failed its brightest minds simply because they were queer. Drop a 3 if Alan Turing's story deserves to be told. Number 4. Bayard Rustin, the gay man who helped change America. When people think of the civil rights movement, they think of Martin Luther King Jr. But what if we told you that one of MLK's closest advisors, the man who orchestrated the famous 1963 March on Washington, was a black gay activist? That man was Bayard Rustin, and history has tried to erase him. Rustin was a brilliant strategist and a lifelong fighter for justice. He introduced MLK to the concept of nonviolent resistance, a philosophy that shaped the civil rights movement. He planned protests, trained activists, and stood on the front lines of change. But being openly gay in the 1950s came at a price. Many within the movement saw his sexuality as a liability. He was arrested, blackmailed, and pushed into the shadows. Even Martin Luther King was pressured to distance himself from Rustin to protect the movement's image. He made history, but was forced to do it from behind the curtain. It wasn't until 2013, 26 years after his death, that Rustin was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, finally recognized for his role in shaping America. His story proves that true leadership isn't about recognition, it's about impact. Drop a 4 if Bayard Rustin's legacy deserves more recognition. Number 5. Tennessee Williams, the playwright who brought queerness to the stage. Some writers entertain, others challenge. Tennessee Williams did both. As one of America's greatest playwrights, he filled the stage with unforgettable characters, flawed, passionate, and deeply human. But what schools rarely teach is that his best work was inspired by his own struggles as a gay man in mid-century America. Williams's plays, like A Streetcar Named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, were groundbreaking. They tackled topics that polite society refused to discuss: repressed desires, broken masculinity, and the cost of living a lie. His characters weren't just fictional. They were mirrors of himself, struggling to exist in a world that rejected them. But Williams paid a price for his honesty. Living as an openly gay man in the 1940s and 50s meant facing constant scrutiny. Critics called his work too sexual. Censors tried to silence him, and even his success couldn't shield him from personal tragedy. Despite everything, he never stopped writing. His plays changed American theater forever, paving the way for future LGBTQ+ stories to be told, raw, real, and unapologetically queer. Drop a 5 if Tennessee Williams' work still resonates today. Number 6. James Baldwin, the writer who refused to stay silent. James Baldwin didn't just write, he spoke truth to power. As a black gay writer in mid-20th century America, he faced racism, homophobia, and censorship. But instead of hiding, he fought back, with words as his weapon. His novels, like Giovanni's Room, were revolutionary. At a time when LGBTQ+ stories were buried, Baldwin wrote about queer love, desire, and identity with brutal honesty. He refused to disguise his characters or make them fit into society's expectations. They were real, raw, and unapologetic. But Baldwin wasn't just a literary icon, he was a civil rights activist. He debated with conservative politicians, marched with Martin Luther King Jr., and called out America's hypocrisy on race and sexuality. His voice was impossible to ignore. Despite his success, Baldwin knew America wasn't ready for him. In the 1970s, he moved to France, where he could live more freely. Even in exile, he never stopped fighting. His words about race, identity, and belonging still echo today. Baldwin's legacy isn't just literature, it's resistance. He proved that being yourself in a world that demands silence is the loudest revolution of all. Drop a 6 if James Baldwin's courage still inspires you. Number 7. Harvey Milk. The politician who refused to hide before Harvey Milk, no openly gay person had ever been elected to major public office in the U.S., but in 1977 that changed. Milk wasn't just a politician, he was a fighter, a trailblazer, and a symbol of hope for LGBTQ+ people everywhere. For years, he lived in the shadows, hiding his identity to avoid discrimination. But in his 40s, he had enough. Moving to San Francisco, he became the loudest voice in the Castro district, rallying for LGBTQ+ rights, workers' rights, and social justice. His message was simple: visibility equals power. His historic election to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors sent shockwaves across the country. Finally, an openly gay man was in office, fighting for his community. He passed groundbreaking anti-discrimination laws, inspiring countless others to come out. But his success made him a target. In 1978, just a year after his election, Milk was assassinated by a former colleague. His life was stolen, but his impact was unstoppable. Today, his name stands as a symbol of courage, proving that change happens when you refuse to be silent. Drop a 7 if Harvey Milk's bravery still inspires you. Number 8. Rudolf Nureyev, the ballet rebel who defected for freedom. Rudolf Nureyev wasn't just a dancer, he was a revolution. In an era where ballet was rigid and conservative, he brought fire, intensity, and a raw physicality that changed the art form forever. But his talent wasn't the only thing that made him a legend. Born in the Soviet Union, Nureyev was a rising star in the Kirov Ballet. But behind the Iron Curtain, being gay was dangerous, and artistic freedom was nearly impossible. In 1961, while touring in Paris, he made a daring move. He defected to the West, becoming the first major Soviet artist to escape. His defection sent shockwaves across the ballet world. Overnight, he became both a hero and a traitor. But in the West, he thrived. His electrifying performances with Margot Fonteyn became legendary, and he redefined masculinity in ballet, proving that male dancers could be just as powerful, athletic, and expressive as their female counterparts. Nureyev lived unapologetically, embracing his queerness despite the risks. Even after being diagnosed with AIDS, he continued to perform, refusing to let anything dim his brilliance. He wasn't just a dancer, he was a symbol of defiance, freedom, and living life on your own terms. Drop an 8 if Rudolf Nureyev's fearless artistry inspires you. Number 9. Freddie Mercury, the rock legend who lived unapologetically. Some voices are unforgettable. Freddie Mercury's was one of them. As the frontman of Queen, he didn't just sing, he commanded the stage. His operatic vocals, flamboyant style, and magnetic presence made him one of the greatest performers of all time. But behind the spotlight, he lived a life of secrecy and struggle. Born Farrokh Bulsara in Zanzibar, Freddie knew early on that he was different. But in the 1970s and 80s, being openly queer in the rock industry was nearly impossible. So he let his music do the talking. From Bohemian Rhapsody to Somebody to Love, his lyrics spoke of passion, pain, and identity in ways the world didn't yet understand. Despite whispers about his sexuality, Freddie refused to be labeled. He embraced both masculinity and femininity, broke every rule of what a rock star should be, and lived fearlessly. But in 1991, after years of speculation, he confirmed that he had AIDS. A day later, he was gone. Even in death, his legacy is untouchable. Freddie Mercury didn't just change music, he showed the world that true icons don't fit into boxes. Drop a 9 if Freddie Mercury's music still gives you chills. These 10 men shaped history, challenged norms, and paved the way for future generations. Yet, most schools never mention them. Why? Because their identities didn't fit the narrative that history books wanted to tell. But history is incomplete without LGBTQ+ voices. Their stories deserve to be heard. Their legacies deserve to be celebrated. From artists to activists, scientists to politicians, these men proved that being queer isn't just a footnote in history. It's a driving force behind progress. Which of these figures inspired you the most? Drop their number in the comments below. And if you believe in uncovering hidden LGBTQ+ history, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more, only on Rainbow Spotlight.